Throughout church history, various groups have had different views on sex. Some groups have even gone as far as to say that sex, in and of itself, in or outside of marriage, is a sin. But this view is really not a biblical view. You see, God, the Bible says, is the author of our nature. He gave us all of the passions and desires of our body. He gave us an appetite for food, and He gave us the means of gratifying that appetite in a lawful manner. God also gave us a type of physical appetite for sex. And He gave us the means of gratification within marriage, a loving relationship between a male and a female in marriage. And so the view that says sex in and of itself is sinful is really a false teaching. You see, in the beginning, when God created everything, He looked upon it and said, "It is good." That means that everything that God designed, everything that God created was good in and of itself, the way He intended it to be. That would include the physical appetites and desires that He gave us naturally. Harris Reedhead said, "When God made us, He gave us many different appetites. But God looked at the being He made and to whom He had given all these appetites and urges and said, 'It is good.'" God intended for mankind to populate the world, and He designed us and created us in such a way as to make that possible. God said in Genesis chapter 1 to Adam and Eve, "Be fruitful and multiply." You see, sex, with its physical passions and desires, was God's idea and creation. Sex is natural and normal. It's part of His intelligent design. You see, God designed the bodies of a male and a female for union. Certainly the devil did not design the functions of our human body. And so sex is God's idea, God's intention. It's natural, it's normal, and it's certainly not of the devil. Augustinianism, in accordance with Gnosticism, believes that our flesh itself is sinful. More specifically, Augustinianism says that the physical desires and passions of the body, or the concupiscence of the flesh, itself is sinful, that it's a curse of the original sin of Adam. Augustinianism says that all physical passion in sex is sinful, that we're born sinful because we're born as a result of physical passion, and that we inherit original sin because we inherit these sexual desires from Adam and Eve. So Augustinianism teaches that God punished all of mankind on account of Adam's sin with sin, the sin of sexual desire. Augustine said, "Sensual lust belongs to the nature of brutes, but is a punishment in man." He said that sexual desire was a disease, a wound inflicted on nature through the treacherous counsel given by the devil, a vice of nature, a deformity, an evil that comes from the depravity of our nature, which is vitiated by sin. He taught that no man was born sinless because no man is now born without concupiscence. And he said that all descending from his, or Adam's, stock are infected with the occult disease of his carnal concupiscence. And he said, the guilt of concupiscence is forgiven through infant baptism. On the other hand, Augustine taught that Christ alone was born without sin because Christ alone was born without sex and all of the physical passions that are involved because Christ was born of a virgin. Augustine said, the virgin conceived without that sensual passion, on which account he, Jesus, alone was born without sin, when he condescended to be born in the flesh. Let's do an internal critique using Augustine's own presuppositions. Let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that Augustine is right, and that 1. Sexual desire is original sin, or a sinful nature inherited from Adam. And 2, that Jesus was born without original sin, or without a sinful nature, because he was born of a virgin. The Bible says that 1. Jesus was made in all things likened unto his brethren. And 2, Jesus was tempted in all points, yet without sin. Well, if Jesus was made in all things likened unto his brethren, he had the same human nature that we have. And if Jesus was tempted in all points like we are, that would mean that Jesus was tempted sexually. But how could Jesus be tempted sexually if he didn't have any sexual desires, since he was born without inherited original sin? And if Jesus was tempted sexually, how could he be without sin if sexual desire itself is a sin? And so Augustine's theology, as usual, contradicts the Bible. This view that says that sexual desire is a curse of the original sin of Adam, and that the sin that we inherit from Adam is the sin of sexual desire, is also the Lutheran view. You see, Martin Luther learned much of his theology from Augustine. In fact, the Roman Catholic theologian Augustine was Martin Luther's favorite theologian. And much of his Reformation was really just a revival of Augustinian theology. Lutheran theology teaches that the concupiscence of the flesh, or the inclination or temptation of the body towards sin, is in and of itself a sin. That the temptation to sin is a sin. The Apology of the Augsburg Confession says, original sin is concupiscence, and also the constant inclination of the nature, and the entire person with its nature is born in sin as with a hereditary disease. Lutherans, just like the Augustinians, believe that sin was a hereditary disease instead of exclusively a crime or choice of the will. You see, crime relates to law and choice, and that can be justly punished. But a hereditary disease is an unfortunate calamity, and only an unreasonable and unjust person would even think about punishing and blaming someone for being born with a hereditary disease. Augustine's negative views on sex seem to stem from his extremely sensual life prior to his conversion, his time in the Gnostic sect known as Manichaeanism, and his struggles with sexual desire after taking a vow of chastity. You see, Augustine had a child out of wedlock named Adeodatus with his concubine, and Augustine even said that prostitution was necessary for society. Augustine said, "If you expel prostitution from society, you will unsettle everything on account of lusts." Catholic priest Thomas Roche, the chair of theological studies at Loyola Marymount University, said, "It's regrettable that St. Augustine's influence and the negative appraisal of sexuality, based on his own struggles to be chaste, has so impacted negatively with Christian tradition." Not everyone in Augustine's day shared his negative views on sex. His theological opponents, the Pelagians, viewed sex as natural, normal, part of God's original intention and design, and certainly not a curse of the original sin of Adam. The Pelagian, Julian of Acclanum, rightly accused Augustine of teaching sexual impulse and the intercourse of married people were devised by the devil, and that therefore those who are born innocent are guilty, and that it is the work of the devil, not of God, that they are born of this diabolical intercourse. And this, without any ambiguity, is Manichaeanism. Albert Henry Newman said, Augustine, the greatest of the Latin fathers, was for many years connected with the Manichaeans, and his modes of thought were greatly affected by this experience. Harnack said, we have, finally, in Augustine's doctrine of sin, a strong Manichaean and Gnostic element, for Augustine never wholly surmounted Manichaeanism. Dennis Carroll said, Manichaeans also taught that sexual intercourse was satanic. Augustine taught that through sexual intercourse we pass on evil or sinfulness to our children. So I see these significant parallels between these two systems. Harnack said, the most remarkable feature in the sexual sphere was, in his, Augustine's view, the involuntariness of the impulse. But instead of inferring that it could not therefore be sinful, and this should have been the inference in keeping with the principle omni peccatum ex voluntate, he rather concludes that there is a sin which belongs to nature, namely, to natural vitiate, and not to the sphere of the will. He accordingly perceives a sin rooted in nature, of course in the form which it has assumed, a sin that propagates itself with our nature. It would be easy now to prove that in thinking of inherited sin, he always has chiefly in view this very sin, the lust of procreation. And Augustine imagined paradisiacal marriages in which children were begotten without lust, or as Julian says jestingly, were to be shaken from the trees. All that he here maintains had been long ago held by Marcion and the Gnostics. One would have, in fact, to be a very rough being not to be able, and that without Manichaeanism, to sympathize with his feelings. But to yield to it as far as Augustine did, without rejecting marriage in consequence, could only happen at a time when doctrines were as confused as in the 5th century. Alfred T. Overstreet said, Augustine's doctrine of sin, with his belief in the inherent sinfulness of the physical constitution, is wholly Manichaean. His idea that sin is propagated through the marriage union, that sexual desire is sin, and that sexual lust in procreation transmits sin, is also Manichaean. Augustine built his doctrine of original sin upon this premise, that sexual lust in procreation transmits sin. Julian of Eclanum refuted this error of Gnosticism in Augustine's theology by saying this: the sexual impulse, that is, the virility itself, without which there can be no intercourse, is ordained by God. While Adam and Eve realized that they were naked after they sinned, when their eyes had been opened, that does not mean, as Augustine thought, that they did not have any physical or sexual attraction one for another before they sinned. It simply means that in their former state of ignorance, their nakedness did not have any moral connotations to it like it did now. With their eyes being opened, they now had moral principles developed in their minds that were not previously there, and thus they felt the need to cover their naked bodies, especially when speaking to God, not because they didn't have any physical attraction one for another before they sinned, but because they didn't view their nakedness before in any moral light. Adam and Eve were physically designed for each other at creation, and they were intended to be fruitful and multiply through sexual intercourse before they sinned. It's self-evident that God has designed the bodies of men and women for each other, and the physical passions and desires that our bodies have for sex is natural and normal, given to us by God. If a husband and a wife committed to each other in marriage engage in normal sexual relationships one with another, then they're not sinning. They are gratifying their natural God-given desires through lawful means. The Bible says, "Marriage is honorable in all, and the bed undefiled, but whoremongers and adulterers God will judge." And so a person is not born a sinner because of sexual desire. After all, sexual desire doesn't develop until puberty. Sexual desire is not a sinful nature or a perverted desire that we're born with, that we're sinners for inheriting. Sexual desire is not a hereditary original sin. Sexual desire is natural, normal. Physical attraction is a natural state of our flesh and is not in and of itself sinful. Lust, in a sinful sense, is a choice of the will. According to Matthew 5, if you intentionally look upon a woman that you're not married to with lust, then you've already sinned in your heart. And so sin is a state of the heart, not a state of the body. Sex within marriage is not a sin, granted that you're gratifying these desires naturally and lawfully. But sin is not a choice to gratify a sinful nature. Sin is actually a choice to gratify natural God-given desires in an unnatural and unlawful way. There is a world of difference between involuntary and innocent natural attraction and voluntary and sinful lust of the heart. Moral quality belongs to the latter, not the former. When the Bible uses the word concupiscence or lust in the sinful sense, it's using the Greek word epithumia, and it's referring to a desire for what is forbidden. That's what the Bible means when it says, "Mortify therefore your members which are upon the earth, fornication, uncleanness, inordinate affection, evil concupiscence, and covetousness, which is idolatry. And that every one of you should know how to possess his vessel in sanctification and honor, not in the lust of concupiscence, even as the Gentiles which know not God." Notice that it classifies evil concupiscence and lust of concupiscence and not desire itself. It's only lust for what is forbidden that is sinful. But the natural desires of the body for a natural gratification through natural means is not sin at all. And so, because of Augustine's view that sexual desire is always sinful and a result of original sin, he believed that human nature was sinful. And many people today, specifically the Calvinists, still believe that human nature is sinful, even if they don't share the foundational views of that doctrine that Augustine had on sex. A lot of Calvinists today view Augustine as a hero and as a father to the faith. They say that they hold to Augustine's doctrine of original sin and say that if you don't believe in inherited sin or Augustinianism, then you're a heretical Pelagian. But many of them don't even know what the original doctrine of original sin teaches, as Augustine taught, that the involuntary sexual desire of the body was in and of itself sinful, and that all sex is therefore sinful even in marriage. Certainly, the Pelagians were right for rejecting Augustine's doctrine of original sin. If you don't believe that sexual desire or natural attraction is the curse of Adam's original sin, then you do not truly believe in the historic doctrine of original sin. If you believe sexual desire is natural and given by God, you agree with the Pelagians in their doctrine and you reject Augustine's doctrine of original sin. Augustine would label many modern Calvinists as Pelagians, as many of them do not believe that involuntary natural sexual attraction is a sin of nature inherited from Adam. And for those Calvinists who do agree with Augustine on this, they don't realize that their doctrine is Gnostic in origin. I once called into a Calvinist radio show that was talking about how sinful our nature was, and I asked them, is human nature sinful? And they said, yes. And I said, is homosexuality a sin? And they said, yes. And then I said, is homosexuality human nature? And they said, no. And I pointed out this is a contradiction within their system. If human nature itself is sinful and homosexuality is a sin, then how is it that Romans chapter 1 says that homosexuality is against nature, or against our nature, as it's against the design and proper function of the human body? Obviously, if homosexuality is against our nature, as given to us by God, then it's certainly clear that the nature God gives us when He forms us and creates us in the womb is certainly not a sinful nature. Rather than the idea that sin is natural or that we have a sinful nature, the Bible speaks of sin as being unnatural. For example, fornication, homosexuality, bestiality, pedophilia. These are all sins that are contrary to God's design for our bodies, something that's contrary to the proper function of our constitution. The Bible says that it's against your body to commit fornication, that it's against your nature to commit sodomy and homosexuality. You see, Adam did not make these perversions natural to us. The Bible speaks of the wicked as being froward, which means perverse. And that means that the wicked are living unnatural, perverted lives. Sexual perversion is a choice of your own free will to gratify a natural, God-given desire in an unnatural, unlawful, unloving, or selfish way. Don't blame Adam for your choice to be sexually perverted. It is your fault and you're responsible for it because it's your own free choice. And you certainly can't blame God or your Maker who designed you and gave you these desires, because God designed you with these appetites and desires for sex to choose to gratify them through lawful means. You see, God gave us our sexual desires not for them to control us, but for us to control them. Not so that we would be governed by them, but so that we would actually govern them, that they would be governed by us. For this cause, God gave them up to vile affections, for even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature, and likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another, men with men, working that which is unseemingly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error which was meet. Neither yield ye your members as instruments of unrighteousness unto sin, but yield yourselves unto God, as those that are alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness unto God. John Gill said that they change the natural use into that which is against nature, by making use of such ways and methods with themselves or other women to gratify their lusts, which were never designed by nature for such a use. Pelagius said, "For their women change their natural relations into relations which are against nature. Those who turned against God turned everything on its head. For those who forsook the author of nature also could not keep to the order of nature." In 1 Corinthians 6:18, the Bible says fornication is a sin against our body. In Romans 1:26-27, it says homosexuality is against our nature, or against the natural use of the body. And in 1 Corinthians 6:9, it says that sodomy is an abuse of our flesh. And so this Augustinian theology that says original sin is sexual desire, that we're born sinners because we're born through sexual desire and we inherit these desires from our parents, is a false theology. It's Gnostic in origin. It's not biblical. The idea that sin is natural to us, or that our human nature is itself a sin, is really rooted in this Augustinian notion that sex is sinful. And it's a false teaching that has come into the church that ought to be rejected. God is the author of our nature. God designed us with the physical passions and desires that our bodies have, and we need to choose with our free will to gratify them lawfully and naturally. And if we are gratifying our sexual desires unlawfully and unnaturally, it's not God's fault, it's not Adam's fault, it's our fault. And so you need to choose to do it God's way. You need to choose to use your nature and to use the desires of your body in a way that is holy and pleasing to God. Much of the content from this video came from my book called Does Man Inherit a Sinful Nature? And this book thoroughly discusses the issue of Augustinian theology and original sin and a sinful nature. It defends the position that sin is contrary to nature, that sin is a perversion of our nature, a misuse and abuse of our nature, and thoroughly refutes the Augustinian theology that has crept into the church. So if you want to get a copy of my book, you can find my bookstore at my website, openairoutreach.com. And at Open Air Outreach, in our bookstore, you'll also find all the other books that we've made available, classic Christian books that we've reprinted. So thank you, and God bless.